Hi and welcome to the channel. In this video I want to talk about bracketing exposures. So that is taking several exposures of the same scene, usually one underexposed, one normal exposed, and one overexposed. And this process can be automated on modern cameras. I'm going to show you why you should do that, and I'm also going to show you how you can set it up on your camera. There are also many ways to blend these images together in post-processing, and this can have a big effect on the quality and the believability of your final image. I'm going to show you how I do it in Adobe Lightroom. So the skill of bracketing exposures and knowing how to successfully combine them later in post-processing, I think it's a fundamental skill of successful landscape photographers. So let's jump in and have a look. Say I'm not sure whether I want to render this scene in a dark and moody way, like this, or I might choose to go light and airy, like this. The thing is, there's no one correct rendering of this image. It's completely up to the photographer and their particular aesthetic. It may, however, affect how you want to expose the image when you're out in the field. I did, in fact, bracket 3 exposures of this scene because I wasn't 100% sure how I wanted to process the image. So let's analyze the middle exposure, which is probably the exposure I would have taken if I only did one exposure. So shadow detail's pretty good. I can't see much noise. But if we have a look at the highlight area, you can see we've got an odd banding around the sun, which is a sign that the image data has been clipped. It's also more significant when I change the white balance. But if we have a look at the underexposed frame, so the darker capture, there's no obvious clipping or breakup of the image as we darken or change the white balance in this raw image capture. But let's say that this darker exposure was the only capture I took of this scene and I wanted to lighten the shadow area. Well, we do start to see quite a bit of the shadow detail, but it's also quite noisy and a bit soft. We can look at both the lightest and the darkest captures here side by side on screen, and you can clearly see the lower quality in the shadow area in the darker image capture. So I've been spending a bit of time photographing the sunrise from Witch Hill lately, which is a hilltop location about 30 minutes bike ride from home. And it's got me thinking about bracketing exposures because when you're shooting into the sun, and especially if you want to get detail in the landscape, you really do need to bracket exposures because you won't get that full range of detail in just one capture. So that brings me to my endpoints histogram method. So have a look at the histogram on the back of the camera here, and as I move the exposure brighter or darker, you can see how I can never get the complete range of exposure contained within the histogram area. Let's have a look at a few examples of histograms in Lightroom which will approximate what we see on the back of the camera. So for this low contrast scene, I can tell straight away that the histogram is well within the range of the graph, so no need to bracket this image. And for this shot here, I've intentionally clipped the dark areas as I knew I wanted to render this image as a silhouette. So only one shot needed there. And if we have a look at the 3 separate exposures for that sunrise image we looked at earlier, you can see none of them have the histogram contained completely within the histogram area. It's going off either end of the scale in all of the images. So that's a definite sign that I need to bracket the image to get the range of exposure if I want shadow detail and highlight detail. So how do I take my bracketed exposures? As a general rule, when bracketing exposures, you should change the shutter speed rather than the aperture or ISO. Because if you vary the aperture, you're likely to vary the depth of field between shots, and they won't merge together very well. Also, if you vary the ISO, the level of noise will vary between the images, and again, they won't merge together very well. I also suggest using automated exposure bracketing on your camera. Apart from being faster than manually changing the shutter speed, you're less likely to introduce movement to your exposures by either moving the camera or something moving in the scene, such as leaves blowing in the wind. So to set up automatic exposure bracketing on Sony Alpha cameras, go to your drive mode and then scroll down to continuous bracket. And from there you can scroll through the various options, and I'm going for a 2-stop range, so 2 EV range and 3 images bracketed, because I find that this is ample for getting the complete exposure range when I'm shooting into a bright light source, and I'm also shooting in the raw file format. And so once you've done that, you can just hold your finger on the shutter button. And once you've done that, 3 shots will be taken in quick succession: light, medium, and dark. Also, use a tripod and remote release if you can. This is the best way to make sure your exposures stay in registration, and also you're less likely to show movement between the frames. So how do I process bracketed exposures? Over the years, I've tried many methods of combining exposures, including Photoshop's Merge to HDR Pro and the standalone Photomatic Pro software. But currently I find Lightroom's Photomerge HDR method works for nearly all of my HDR merging. So get to it, make sure you have your different exposures selected, right-click and select Photomerge HDR. Lightroom will open up the 3 images in the Merge to HDR dialog box. You've got a few options in there. I don't usually use auto align unless I haven't had the camera on a tripod. Auto settings I don't really use because I prefer to adjust the image myself. You can also try different levels of deghosting if you've had a bit of movement in the scene, usually due to things blowing around in the wind. And you can also create a stack, but I usually choose not to do that. Click OK, and Lightroom will generate a new RAW file in the DNG file format. And what's different about this image is that instead of the normal -5 to +5 exposure range, you now have a -10 to +10 exposure range. So a lot more brightness data to work with when you're doing global or local corrections in Lightroom. One of the only reasons I sometimes still need to go to Photoshop is when I've taken a separate shot with my finger over the sun, as in this example here, to reduce the lens flare on the landscape. So this is a well-known trick, but you do need a layer-based software like Photoshop to blend the images together. Here's how to do it. I have my processed HDR versions with and without the finger here in Lightroom. I right-click on one of them and go to Edit, Open as Smart Object Layers in Photoshop. I like to make sure the thumb layer is on top, and then add a mask and with a large soft brush paint out the finger. Save the file, and the updated image will show up in Lightroom as a finished composite. And if you want to re-edit the raw processing parts of the image, right-click on the composite file in Lightroom, go to Edit in Adobe Photoshop, and make sure you select Edit Original. And once you're in Photoshop, you can double-click one of the layers, and you have full access to all of your raw adjustments just as you left them. This is really a non-destructive workflow. So for example, if I want to make the sunset darker, I double-click that layer, reduce the exposure, click OK, and then the composite file will update accordingly in Lightroom as well. So there you have it. Bracketing exposures is a bit like an insurance policy. So if you're not sure of what the exposure should be, take one over and one under, as well as the average shot, to cover your bases. And for landscape photographers, it's really useful to automate that process so that you can just hold your finger on the shutter button and 3 shots are taken in quick succession. And if you want to learn more about exposure and the histogram, I've made a deep dive video into that, and you can link to that up here. So thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.